Her husband hadn't really looked at her in 2 years. 2 years of silence. Of coming home to a man who felt like a stranger in an expensive suit. Of smiling at the right moments, playing the perfect wife, while slowly disappearing inside herself. Bella Hart had the life people dreamed about, but photographs don't capture the sound of a door closing without a word. They don't capture the weight of sitting beside someone every night and feeling completely alone. She had stopped expecting to be seen, then Joseph did, and everything changed. A stranger with a camera and quiet eyes who looked at her like she was worth looking at, like she mattered. And something Bella had buried deep began pushing its way back to the surface. Because nothing wakes a cold man faster than watching another man fall. Lucas Hart spent 2 years treating his wife like background noise until he saw that look in her eyes, that smile that wasn't meant for him. And something shifted, something that felt a lot like jealousy wearing the mask of love. The question is, was it already too late? Sign up so you don't miss a single episode of this journey. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you believe that every woman deserves to be truly seen and loved, give it a like. It costs nothing, but it means a lot. The new Hart Enterprises headquarters in Los Angeles glittered like a diamond against the night sky. Crystal chandeliers poured amber light over executives in tailored suits and women in floor-length gowns, while the soft sound of a string quartet filled the air with a rehearsed kind of elegance. Everything was polished, everything was deliberate, everything was exactly as Lucas Hart had planned it to be. Bella Hart stood in the center of all of it and felt completely alone. She held a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, her fingers wrapped around the stem more out of habit than desire. From across the room, she watched her husband. Lucas was magnetic like that. Jaw tilted slightly to one side as he listened to some investor, that calculated smile he reserved for events like this one, so different from his real smile, the one she hadn't seen in months. The one that used to appear without warning, usually on a Sunday morning when he thought no one was paying attention. He hadn't looked at her once since they arrived. Bella took a slow breath and turned toward the window. Los Angeles stretched below them in a sea of amber and white light, millions of lives burning quietly in the dark. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the cold glass and let herself wonder for just a moment what it would feel like to be one of those anonymous lights down there. Unknown, unburdened, free from the strange loneliness of standing in a room full of people who knew her name, but not a single true thing about her. She was wearing a deep rose gown that evening, floor-length, simple, the kind of dress that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. She had chosen it carefully, the way she chose most things now, quietly, without expectation, because expectation had a way of becoming something that hurt. "You're somewhere else entirely," the voice came from nearby. Bella turned and found a man she didn't recognize, tall, dark eyes, holding a professional camera with the ease of someone carrying an extension of their own body. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wasn't performing anything. He was simply there, watching her with a calm that felt almost unfamiliar, in a room running entirely on ambition. "I'm sorry?" she said. "Physically, you're here." He gestured slightly toward the room. "But your eyes are somewhere else." He lifted the camera. "May I?" She didn't know why she nodded, but she did. The click was soft, almost gentle. And for the first time that evening, someone had actually looked at her, not at the last name she carried or the dress she wore or the role she was expected to perform. Just her, standing at a window with untouched champagne and a quiet that had been building for 2 years. "Joseph Miller," he said, lowering the camera and extending his hand. "Bella Hart," he smiled. No reaction to the last name. No shift in posture, no recalibration of tone, none of the subtle adjustments people made when they realized who she was married to. Just a smile, open and unhurried, like she had said something worth smiling about. "Bella," he repeated, as though he was simply testing the weight of the word. "It suits you." She didn't know what to say to that. Compliments had become unfamiliar things, objects she no longer quite knew how to hold. So she said nothing, and somehow the silence between them didn't feel awkward. It felt like the beginning of something she couldn't name yet. Across the room, Lucas laughed at something a silver-haired man in a grey suit had said. He adjusted his cufflink. He shook another hand. He existed, entirely and completely, in a world that had no space in it for her. Bella turned back to Joseph, who was reviewing the photo on the small screen of his camera. He tilted it toward her without a word. She looked at the image. A woman in rose framed by city light, with an expression caught somewhere between longing and resolve, like someone standing at the edge of a decision they hadn't made yet. She handed the camera back slowly. "You're good," she said quietly. "I just photograph what's already there," he replied. And somewhere behind her, without knowing it, Lucas Hart was already losing something he didn't yet realize he had stopped holding. The cafeteria sat tucked inside a narrow alley 2 blocks from the beach in Malibu. It had white-painted wooden windows, the smell of cinnamon and fresh coffee drifting out onto the street, and a view of the ocean that made every problem in the world feel slightly smaller. It was the kind of place that didn't advertise itself, the kind you only found if you were already looking for something. Bella had found it by accident, or maybe not entirely by accident. She had driven that morning without a destination, the way she sometimes did when the house felt too large and too quiet at the same time, and somehow ended up parked on a street where the sea breeze carried the scent of cardamom and toasted bread. She ordered a chai latte,
There you
chose
are.
a small table by the window,
I was starting to think you
and
wouldn't
opened
show
her
up.
worn copy of a Clarice Lispector
I
short
wouldn't miss
story
this for
collection,
the world.
the kind of book she used to teach, the kind she hadn't read for pleasure in longer than she cared to admit. She was 3 pages in when she heard the voice. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up. Joseph Miller stood on the other side of the table, camera strap over one shoulder, with the same unhurried expression he'd worn at the gala 3 days earlier. He looked different in daylight, less like a stranger and more like someone she had simply not yet had enough time with. Bella closed the book slowly. "What a coincidence," she said. "I live 5 minutes from here," he replied, pulling out the chair and sitting without ceremony. "I come every week. You?" "First time." He ordered a black coffee. She ordered another chai, and somehow the conversation that followed felt nothing like small talk. It began with the book in her hands, drifted naturally into photography, and somewhere along the way arrived at dreams, the ones that existed before life became too serious to sustain them. "Did you teach literature before you got married?" he asked. "I still teach." He tilted his head, curious. "You used the past tense when you mentioned your students earlier." He paused, like it was a different life. Bella went quiet for a moment. It was startling how carefully he listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually hearing the spaces between her words. "Sometimes it feels that way," she admitted. Outside, a couple walked past with a dog pulling enthusiastically at its leash. The sound of the ocean reached them in low, steady intervals. Joseph wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her the way she imagined he looked through a camera lens, not to capture but to understand. "What did you want to be?" he asked, "before you became who you are now?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not invasive, not presumptuous, just honest in a way that most questions weren't anymore. "A writer," she said, and the word felt strange in her mouth, like something she had stored in a box and forgotten about until just now. "I used to write every day, short stories mostly. Nothing for anyone else, just for me." What happened to that? She looked out at the strip of ocean visible between the buildings. "Life got loud," she said, and somehow the writing got quiet. Joseph nodded slowly, like he understood something more than the words themselves. He didn't rush to fill the silence with advice or reassurance. He just let it exist, and in that space, Bella felt something shift, a small, quiet loosening of something she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. They stayed in that cafeteria for 3 hours. They talked about his mother, who had taught him that light was never just light. It was memory and mood and truth all at once. They talked about her students, the ones who wrote about grief without knowing that's what they were doing. They talked about Big Sur and Patagonia, and a village in Portugal neither of them had visited but both had imagined. When she finally looked at the time, she was almost surprised that hours had passed. Outside, the afternoon light had turned the kind of gold that makes ordinary streets look like something worth photographing. Bella drove home along the coast, windows down, the sea air moving through her hair. When she walked into the house, it was empty. A note on the kitchen island in Lucas's precise handwriting, "Back Thursday. Kiss." She stood there holding the small square of paper. Read it twice. folded it carefully along its original crease and set it back down on the marble counter. Then she stood in the silence of her beautiful, expensive, immaculate kitchen and felt the full weight of every word that note didn't say. The classes had flavor again. Bella noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of unremarkable weekday that usually passed without leaving anything behind. She had asked her students to write about a moment when they felt completely alive, not happy, not successful, not proud, alive. The room went quiet with the kind of silence that precedes something real, the kind that has weight and texture, and then the pencils began to move. She walked slowly between the rows, hands folded behind her back, reading over shoulders. A girl in the third row wrote about her grandmother's voice on Sunday mornings, the specific way it sounded coming from the kitchen before anyone else was awake. A quiet boy near the window described the smell of rain in a city he had never visited, but had dreamed about so vividly it felt like memory. A boy who rarely spoke wrote 3 words, crossed them out and wrote them again in larger letters, as if committing to something. Bella felt something expand inside her chest. She stopped at the front of the room and looked at her students, really looked at them, and understood, with a clarity that almost hurt, that this was the thing she had been missing. Not the teaching itself, the witnessing, the privilege of being present when someone discovered something true about themselves. When was the last time I wrote about a moment like that? The thought arrived quietly without accusation, but it stayed. That evening she pulled out a notebook she hadn't opened in almost a year. Cream-colored, slightly worn at the corners, a gift she had bought herself and never quite felt entitled to use. She took it to the back terrace, curled into the outdoor chair with her knees drawn up, and pressed the pen against the first page. She didn't write anything important, just fragments, impressions, the smell of cardamom in a small cafe, the sound of a camera shutter in a crowded room, the feeling of being asked a question and realizing, mid-answer, that you had forgotten you knew the answer at all. She was still there when she heard the sliding door open behind her. Lucas had returned from New York a day earlier than expected. She heard him pause in the doorway. The particular quality of his stillness told her he had seen her before she turned around. She had learned over the years to read his silences the way other people read expressions. "What are you writing?" he asked. His voice was careful, not cold, just measured, the way he was when he wasn't sure what he was walking into. "Nothing yet," she replied without lifting her eyes from the page. It was true in a sense. The words she had written felt too new and too fragile to be claimed as anything yet, like something that needed more darkness before it could grow. Lucas stepped onto the terrace. She felt him standing behind her, close enough that she could detect the faint scent of his cologne, cedar, and something sharp, the same one he'd worn for years. He looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary, longer than he usually did. There was something different about her, and he could feel it without being able to name it. A quality in the way she sat, not tense, not waiting for anything, just present in a way she hadn't been in a long time. Like a room that had been aired out after all the windows had been shut for too long. It made him uncomfortable in a way he didn't examine. "You should come inside," he said finally. "It's getting cold." "In a little while," she answered. He waited one more second. Then he went inside and she heard the quiet sound of the door sliding closed behind him. Bella turned back to her notebook. The city lights below the hill glimmered in the dark, and the pen in her hand felt lighter than it had in months. She wasn't sure what she was writing toward. She wasn't sure it mattered yet. What mattered was that she was writing at all. And somewhere in the living room, Lucas Hart poured himself a glass of water he didn't particularly want, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at nothing, with the distinct and unsettling feeling that something in his house had shifted, quietly, without announcement, and he had no idea when it had begun. The rain over Malibu was the kind that bent the palm trees sideways and turned the ocean into something dark and furious. It arrived without much warning in the late afternoon, the way the most disruptive things tend to, quietly at first, then all at once. By evening the coast was unrecognizable, the kind of night that made the inside of a house feel either like shelter or like a cage, depending on who you were and what you were waiting for. Bella was waiting for nothing. She stood barefoot on the covered section of the terrace, arms folded loosely across her chest, watching the waves break against the rocks far below. The sound was massive and rhythmic and indifferent. The ocean didn't care about any of it. Not about the rain, not about the wind, not about the woman standing above it in a deep burgundy wrap dress, with her hair beginning to curl at the edges from the humidity. Lucas had cancelled dinner an hour ago. A message. Not even a call. Emergency meeting. Sorry, we'll make up for it Friday. She had read it twice, set her phone face down on the counter and come outside. She wasn't angry. That was the strange part. She had moved past anger somewhere in the last several months and arrived at something quieter and more difficult, a kind of acceptance that felt uncomfortably close to resignation. Her phone buzzed against the outdoor table. She glanced at the screen. Joseph. There's an exhibition at a converted warehouse in the Arts District tonight. A Colombian photographer. Images that will knock the ground out from under you. Do you want to come? She stared at the message for a long moment. The rain intensified briefly, drumming hard against the awning above her head, then softened again into something steadier. She was aware of a particular kind of stillness inside herself, not indecision, but something more honest than that. The kind of pause that happens when you already know the answer, and are simply giving yourself one last moment before you say it out loud. She typed back, "I'll be ready in 40 minutes." The exhibition occupied a massive industrial space in the Arts District, its raw concrete walls transformed into something reverential by the sheer scale of the photographs hanging on them. Each image was enormous, faces and bodies and moments captured with the kind of precision that felt almost violent in its intimacy. These were not posed photographs. They were stolen seconds, real life caught off guard by someone who knew exactly where to look. Bella moved through the space slowly, hands tucked into the pockets of her burgundy wrap, her heels quiet against the polished floor. Joseph walked beside her without crowding her, pointing occasionally at a detail. The way light fell across a particular shoulder, the tension in a pair of hands, the geometry of a shadow. She stopped in front of one photograph and didn't move for a long time. It showed a woman from behind standing at a large window, the light cutting across her profile in a way that made it impossible to tell whether she was about to cry or smile. The ambiguity of it was devastating. The woman could have been anyone. She could have been Bella. The photographer said she was looking at her husband, Joseph said quietly, coming to stand beside her. But her husband wasn't in the room. Bella said nothing. She felt the words settle somewhere deep and stay there. They stayed at the exhibition for 2 hours. By the time they stepped outside, the rain had returned, lighter now, more like a suggestion than a declaration. Joseph held an umbrella over both of them while they waited for a car, and the proximity was simply inevitable. Shoulders touching, breath visible in the cold night air, the warmth between two people standing close in the dark. When the car finally appeared at the curb, he turned to her and pulled her into a hug. It wasn't planned, it wasn't careful. It was the kind of embrace that happens when two people have been honest with each other for long enough that the body simply follows. She felt his hand between her shoulder blades, steady and warm, and she closed her eyes. 2 seconds, maybe 3. When she stepped back, neither of them said anything. The car door was open. The rain was still falling softly, and Bella Hart climbed inside, carrying something she hadn't arrived with. Something warm and wordless and slightly frightening, pressed quietly against her ribs all the way home. Lucas Hart did not feel guilt easily. It was a quality that had served him well over the years, the ability to make hard decisions without buckling beneath their weight, to close a deal or cut a loss or walk away from a table without carrying the wreckage home with him. Sentiment, his father had told him once, was a luxury that successful men could not afford. And Lucas, who had spent the better part of his life trying to earn something from that man that never came, had believed it. He believed it a little less on the morning he found the photograph. It was sitting on his assistant's desk, printed as part of a press kit for the company's launch event, a collection of images from that evening, curated for media distribution. He had stopped by her office for something unrelated, some document that needed a signature, and his eyes had caught it before he could look away. Bella. She was standing in the far corner of the room in profile, holding a champagne glass she clearly hadn't touched. The rose of her dress caught the light in a way that separated her from everything around her, made her somehow more vivid than the rest of the room. But it wasn't the dress or the light that stopped him. It was her expression. She was smiling. Not the smile she used at events, the one he recognized as performance, the one they had both perfected over years of standing side by side in rooms exactly like that one. This was something else entirely. Private and unguarded. The kind of smile a person has when they are alone inside their own thoughts and stumble upon something unexpectedly beautiful there. He could not remember the last time he had seen that smile directed at something real. He could not remember the last time he had tried to be the reason for it. Lucas picked up the photograph carefully, the way you pick up something you suspect might be more fragile than it looks. He stood there for a long moment in his assistant's office, in his expensive suit, in the middle of a day scheduled to the quarter hour, and felt something move through him that he was not prepared for. "Who took this?" he asked, his voice even. "Joseph Miller," his assistant replied without looking up from her screen. "The freelance photographer we hired for the event. He does a lot of editorial work, gallery exhibitions, very well regarded." "Thank you." He set the photograph back down on the desk, slowly, precisely, and walked back to his own office without the document he had come for. He sat at his desk for several minutes without opening his laptop. The city spread out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, enormous and indifferent, and Lucas Hart, who had negotiated with men twice his size and never once let them see him uncertain, sat very still and let himself feel something he usually kept behind glass. He had looked at that photograph and seen his wife the way a stranger had seen her, with attention, with care, with the kind of unhurried focus that says, "You are worth looking at," without needing to say anything at all. And he had not been the one holding the camera. That evening he left the office at 7, early by his standards. He drove home along the coast with the radio off, the city lights sliding past the windows in long amber streaks. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was lit softly from within, warm against the dark hillside. He found Bella in the living room, tucked into the corner of the sofa, with a book open across her knees. She was wearing a soft rose-colored sweater, her hair loose, her feet tucked beneath her, in the way she always sat when she thought no one was watching. She looked up when he came in, and for just a fraction of a second, before her expression settled into its usual careful neutrality, he saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, and underneath the surprise, something more complicated. "You're home early," she said. "I wanted to be here," he replied. She looked at him for a moment, reading him the way she always had, quietly, thoroughly, without giving much away. Then she nodded once and returned to her book. Lucas sat down in the chair across from her. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't open his laptop. He just sat there in the warm quiet of the room, watching her turn a page, and tried to remember when he had last chosen to simply be in the same space as her, without an agenda. He couldn't, and that, more than anything else, told him exactly how far he had let things go. The neighborhood looked like someone had decided that walls were canvases and acted accordingly. Murals stretched across entire building faces in the east side of Los Angeles. Portraits of women with flowers woven into their hair, abstract explosions of color that had no name, figures reaching upward toward things just outside the frame. Art students had installed small sculptures on the sidewalks overnight, the kind of work that made you stop mid-step and reconsider something you thought you already understood. It was loud and alive and entirely itself, and Bella felt the tension leave her shoulders the moment she stepped out of her car. Joseph was already there when she arrived, crouched beside a group of teenagers who were arguing cheerfully about camera angles. He looked up when he heard her footsteps and smiled. Easy and immediate, the way some people smile when something genuinely good has just happened. "You came," he said, standing. "You asked," she replied. It was a simple exchange, but underneath it ran something neither of them acknowledged directly. The project was a community photography workshop, young people from the neighborhood given disposable cameras, and one instruction: photograph what you love. Joseph had organized it in partnership with a local arts foundation, and he had called Bella because, as he put it, the kids needed someone who knew how to make people feel safe enough to tell the truth. She had not expected how completely right he would be. Within the first hour, she was sitting cross-legged on the concrete beside a 16-year-old named Darius, who was trying to photograph his little sister, but kept getting the framing wrong. Bella watched him for a moment, then leaned over gently. "You're shooting what she looks like," she said. "Try shooting what she makes you feel." Darius looked at her sideways. Then he raised the camera again, waited, and pressed the shutter at the exact moment his sister threw her head back, laughing at something their friend had said. He looked at the result and went very quiet. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's her." Bella laughed, and it surprised her. The fullness of it, the way it came from somewhere unguarded. She hadn't laughed like that in longer than she could measure. The afternoon moved the way good days do, faster than you want and slower than you expect, full of small moments that don't announce their own significance. She helped a shy girl named Marisol find the courage to photograph strangers. She listened to a boy named Trey talk about his father for 20 minutes, while Joseph photographed the city behind them, pretending not to listen, but hearing everything. By the time the sun began its descent, Los Angeles was doing what it did best, turning ordinary into extraordinary with nothing more than light and angle. The sky went from white to gold to something deeper, and the murals on the walls around them seemed to glow from within, as if they had been waiting all day for exactly this moment. Bella found herself leaning against a painted wall beside Joseph, both of them watching the teenagers review their photographs with the focused intensity of people discovering something for the first time. Her shoulders were warm from the sun. Her feet ached pleasantly from hours of concrete. She felt, and the simplicity of it almost startled her, good. "You're natural at this," Joseph said quietly. "At sitting on the ground. At making people want to tell you things." She smiled, looking straight ahead. "You're not so bad at it yourself." The silence that followed was comfortable and charged at the same time, the kind that happens between two people who have run out of safe things to say and haven't yet decided what to do about it. When she turned to look at him, the last of the sunlight was catching the side of his face, and the distance between them was less than she remembered it being a moment ago. His hand, resting against the wall beside her, had found hers. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The city continued around them, indifferent and magnificent, and somewhere across Los Angeles, in a high-rise office with floor-to-ceiling windows, Lucas Hart's phone buzzed with a message he didn't answer, because for the first time in years, he had left work early to go home to a house that was already empty. Lucas took her to Carmel by the Sea on a Friday with no warning. He appeared in the doorway of her classroom at 3:15 in the afternoon, suit jacket over one arm, tie loosened, looking slightly out of place among the student artwork taped to the walls and the half-erased whiteboard behind her. Bella looked up from the papers she was grading and said nothing for a moment, waiting. "Pack for a weekend," he said. "We leave in an hour." She wanted to ask why. She wanted to say she had plans, or that he should have mentioned it earlier, or that a weekend trip announced 60 minutes in advance was exactly the kind of thing that didn't fix what was broken between them. She wanted to say all of that. Instead, she capped her pen, stacked her papers, and said, "Give me 45 minutes. The drive north took them through Big Sur as the afternoon light turned honey gold over the coastal mountains. Lucas drove, both hands on the wheel, and for the first stretch, neither of them spoke. The silence between them had many textures by now. She had learned to read them the way a musician reads dynamics. This one was not hostile. It was tentative, like the first few notes of something that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. Carmel appeared at dusk, a small, improbable town that looked as though someone had lifted a village from the English countryside and set it down on the California coast without asking permission. Stone cottages with climbing roses, narrow streets without sidewalks, art galleries lit warmly against the darkening sky. Bella rolled down the window and let the cold salt air move through her hair, and despite everything, despite the careful distance she had been maintaining for weeks, she felt something in her chest soften slightly. The restaurant was inside a stone building with a fireplace that filled the room with the smell of wood smoke and warm bread. Their table sat beside a window that looked directly out onto the dark Pacific, waves visible only as white lines appearing and disappearing in the black. Lucas ordered wine. The candle between them threw unsteady light across his face, and Bella noticed, not for the first time but with a new kind of attention, how tired he looked beneath the composure. Not physically tired. Something deeper. "Why here?" she asked once the wine arrived. He turned his glass slowly on the tablecloth. "Because you told me once that you wanted to come here," he said. "Years ago. We were at some dinner, and someone mentioned Carmel, and you said you'd always wanted to see it." He paused. "I said I'd take you, and I never did." Bella looked at him steadily. "I didn't think you remembered that." "I remember more than I've shown," he said quietly. What followed was unlike any conversation they had managed in years. Lucas spoke with a directness she wasn't prepared for, about his father, cold and unreachable, who had measured love in achievement and taught his son to do the same without ever meaning to. About the fear of failure that had quietly colonized his life until the ambition and the fear were so tangled together he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. About the night he had stood in his assistant's office holding a photograph of his wife and seen himself clearly, perhaps for the first time, as a man who had been absent from his own marriage while never once leaving the building. "I stopped seeing you," he said, his voice controlled in the careful way of someone holding something fragile. "I don't have an excuse for it. I just stopped." The fire crackled. Outside, the ocean moved against the rocks with a patience that made human timelines feel small. Bella looked at the candle flame between them for a long moment before she spoke. "Lucas," she said softly, "love was never the problem." He went still. "The problem is that I spent so long trying to be seen that I learned to exist alone inside this marriage." She raised her eyes to his. "And I'm not sure I know how to undo that, just because you've finally shown up." He didn't look away, didn't reach for his wine or his phone or any of the exits he usually took when conversations became uncomfortable. He simply sat across from her in the firelight, absorbing every word she said, and for the first time in a very long time, Bella felt that she had been heard by the one person who should have been listening all along. But being heard, she was discovering, was not the same as knowing what came next. The van was a restored moss-green Volkswagen that had clearly lived a full life before Joseph got to it. It had a small crack in the passenger side mirror, a dashboard covered in faded stickers from places Bella didn't recognize, and a sound system that was somehow both ancient and perfectly functional. When Joseph pulled up outside her school on a Saturday morning at 6:15, the engine humming quietly in the pale early light, Bella stood on the sidewalk with a canvas bag over her shoulder and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, uncomplicated anticipation. She climbed in. The seat was warm. Someone, Joseph clearly, had brought a thermos of coffee and 2 paper cups, and the radio was already playing something low and unhurried. He handed her a cup without ceremony, the way you do with someone you've known long enough that small gestures don't require explanation. "Ready?" he asked. "Since 5:30, she admitted. He laughed, and they pulled away from the curb into a city that was only just waking up. The Highway 1 was unreasonable at that hour, the kind of beauty that feels almost aggressive in its insistence. Cliff on one side dropping straight into the Pacific, mountain rising on the other, the road itself a thin ribbon of human ambition carved into the edge of the continent. The sun was climbing behind the hills, turning the fog that hung over the water into something luminous and strange. Bella sat sideways in her seat with her knees pulled up, photographing through the window with her phone like a teenager on a school trip, and she didn't care even slightly. Joseph glanced over at her once and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way she had memorized without meaning to. They stopped at Bixby Bridge, where the arch of old concrete spanning the gorge looked like something a painter had invented. They walked a stretch of coastal trail, where the wind was strong enough to require leaning into it, and Bella held her hair back with one hand and laughed at the effort of it. They found a roadside bakery in a town with one street and bought sourdough bread and 3 kinds of cheese, and something wrapped in paper that turned out to be a dense, perfect almond cake. They ate lunch on a blanket spread over the grass at a small overlook, the Pacific enormous and silver below them, the air tasting of salt and wild sage. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Bella said suddenly, tearing a piece of bread. Joseph was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water. "When my mother died," he said, "I didn't cry at the funeral. I held it together the whole day through all of it." He paused. 3 weeks later, I was sitting alone in a parking lot outside a grocery store, and a song came on the radio that she absolutely hated, said it was too sentimental, and I just fell apart, completely, alone in a parking lot over a song she would have turned off immediately. He stopped. The wind moved through the grass around them. "I always felt guilty about that," he said. "Like I cried at the wrong time in the wrong place for the wrong reasons." Bella looked at him steadily. "Grief waits until you're safe enough to feel it," she said. "There's no wrong time for that." He turned to look at her. The late afternoon light was doing something specific to the angle of his face, drawing shadows that made him look both younger and older at once, and she realized with a quiet shock that she had been memorizing his expressions without ever deciding to. Joseph leaned toward her slowly, slowly enough that she understood what was happening, slowly enough that she could have shifted back, changed the angle, redirected the moment. She didn't. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, almost a question. Then it became something else entirely. It tasted of salt air and almond, and weeks of things unspoken, and when she placed her hand flat against his chest to steady herself, she felt his heart beating fast and hard beneath her palm, keeping perfect time with her own. When they finally separated, the sun was nearly at the horizon, burning the water gold and red. "Bella," he said, his voice low. "I know," she answered. And she did. She knew exactly what the word contained, the weight of it, the complication of it, the fact that knowing something and deciding something were two entirely different things, and that she was standing precisely at the place where one ended and the other began. Lucas' heart did not do unexpected things. His life ran on precision, meetings scheduled weeks in advance, decisions made with complete information, emotions processed privately and efficiently, and never allowed to interfere with the architecture of a day. The people who worked for him knew this. His assistant knew this. Even Bella, after years of marriage, had come to accept it as simply the shape of the man she had chosen. Which was why when she walked out of her last class on a Wednesday afternoon and found him standing in the outdoor corridor of her school, she stopped completely. He was leaning against the wall beside the door, jacket on, tie loosened in the way it only ever was by late afternoon, looking entirely out of place among the painted hallway murals and the sound of students filing out around him. A few of them glanced at him with the particular curiosity teenagers reserve for adults who appear in the wrong context. He didn't seem to notice. He was watching for her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, shifting her bag onto her shoulder. "Waiting for you," he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment, reading him the way she always had, carefully, without giving herself away. Then she turned and walked toward her classroom. He followed. The room was empty, afternoon light falling in long rectangles across the desks, the whiteboard still covered in the day's notes. Bella set her bag down on her desk and turned to face him. He had stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him in a very long time. Unguarded, almost uncertain. "Lucas," she said, in a tone that was both his name and a warning. "I'll cancel everything," he said. The words came out clean and direct, the way he spoke in boardrooms when he had already made a decision and was simply informing the room. The dinners, the trips, the weekend calls, all of it. "You can't just—" "I already did," he said. "The whole week. I cleared it this morning." She looked at him steadily. "Clearing your calendar isn't the same as—" "I know that," he said, and something in his voice shifted, lower, more careful, stripped of the boardroom certainty. "I'm not here because I'm afraid of losing. I want you to understand that. I'm not standing here running damage control." He took a step toward her. "I'm here because losing you would mean losing the only thing that has ever actually mattered. And I have spent years acting like that wasn't true, and I don't know how to make up for that time, but I know I can't spend another day pretending I don't see what's happening." Bella felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't move. He crossed the remaining distance between them, slowly, deliberately, and placed both hands flat on the desk behind her, one on each side, not touching her, but enclosing the space around her with his presence, in a way that made retreat feel theoretical rather than real. It wasn't aggression, it was attention, total and unmoving, the kind he usually reserved for negotiations worth millions, now directed entirely at her. "I see you," he said, his voice quiet, his face close enough that she could see the particular shade of his eyes in the afternoon light, darker than usual, completely focused. The notebook on the terrace, the way your voice changes when you talk about your students, the way you hold your cup with both hands when you're thinking something through. He paused. "I never stopped seeing those things. I just stopped letting you know that I did." Bella's back was against the desk. The room was very quiet. "That doesn't erase what's already there," she said, but her voice had lost some of its steadiness. "No," he agreed without flinching. It doesn't. But I would spend the rest of my life building something different, if you let me. The afternoon light moved slowly across the floor between them. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed. The school was emptying out around them, leaving them alone in a room full of other people's unfinished work. Bella looked at him, really looked the way she had learned to look at things again these past weeks, and what she saw was not the man who had made her invisible. It was a man standing in a school corridor in an expensive suit, completely stripped of every defense he had spent a lifetime constructing, asking for something he wasn't sure he deserved. She didn't say yes that afternoon, but her hands, which had been folded across her chest since he walked in, dropped quietly to her sides. Santa Catalina Island sat 40 minutes off the coast of Los Angeles by ferry, and it existed in the particular way that islands do, slightly removed from the logic of the mainland, operating on its own quiet terms. Narrow streets too small for most cars, houses painted in colors that would look excessive anywhere else and looked exactly right here. A harbor where the water was the kind of blue that made you wonder if you had simply been looking at the wrong ocean your entire life. Bella had come alone first. She had taken the early ferry on a Tuesday, checked into a small inn 2 blocks from the harbor, and spent 4 days doing almost nothing. She walked. She sat on the pier with coffee and watched the pelicans negotiate the morning air. She wrote in her notebook, real writing this time, not fragments, full pages that surprised her with what they contained. She swam in the cold water of the cove until her arms ached and her mind went quiet. She ate dinner alone at a table by the window and did not feel lonely doing it. She had needed to know that she could. On the 4th evening, she sat on the small balcony of her room as the sun went down over the Pacific, and she let herself think clearly, without the noise of the house, without the weight of habit, without the complicated pull of 2 different men and 2 different versions of what her life could be. She thought about who she had been before she became someone's wife. She thought about the woman in the photograph at the exhibition, standing at a window, facing something just outside the frame. She thought about what it meant to choose something not out of fear or exhaustion or the path of least resistance, but out of genuine, clear-eyed desire. By the time the sky went dark, she knew what she wanted. Not just who, but how, the terms on which she was willing to live, the version of herself she refused to abandon again, regardless of what came next. She called Lucas that night, told him to take the first ferry on Saturday morning. She was waiting on the wooden pier when the boat came in, standing in the clean morning light in a white linen dress with her hair loose and the wind coming off the water at her back. She watched the passengers file down the gangway, and then she saw him, and even from that distance she could see him stop when he found her face in the crowd. He came to her without hurrying, as though he understood that this moment deserved to be walked toward rather than rushed. When he reached her, she spoke before he could. "I didn't choose you out of fear," she said. Her voice was steady. The wind moved her hair across her face, and she didn't reach up to fix it. "I didn't choose you out of habit or because it was easier or because I didn't have anywhere else to go." Lucas stood completely still. The harbor moved and sounded around them, ropes and water and the low engine of a departing boat, and none of it touched the space between them. "I chose you because I still love you," she said, "and because you finally stopped asking me to choose between that love and myself." He closed his eyes, just for a second, the briefest closing, like someone receiving something they had not been sure was still coming. When he opened them again, there was something undone in his expression, something that years of careful composure had never quite allowed before, and Bella recognized it as the thing she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. He pulled her in, without elegance or calculation. Both arms completely, the way you hold something you came dangerously close to losing. She felt his chin against the top of her head, his chest solid and warm against her cheek, his heartbeat steady and fast at the same time. She let herself be held, fully, without reservation, without the careful distance she had been maintaining for so long that it had started to feel like self-preservation. When he pulled back slightly to look at her, the harbor light was gold and sharp around them, and when his mouth finally found hers, there was no urgency in it, no debt being repaid, no performance for anyone watching. It was quiet and certain, the kind of kiss that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. The pier swayed gently beneath them, the impossible blue water of Santa Catalina stretched in every direction, and Bella Hart, who had spent 2 years disappearing inside her own life, stood in the morning sun and felt, for the first time in longer than she could measure, entirely and completely found. If this story moved you, you're not alone. Sign up so you don't miss any stories like this. Give it a like. It really helps more than you might think. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I read them all. Go to the first pinned comment. There's something waiting for you there.